Has anyone ever accused you of being too emotional just to dismiss your pain?
Another birthday came and went with nothing from my parents, not a call, not a message, not even the lazy thumbs-up reaction to a friend's post, and as the hours dragged I kept telling myself to be an adult about it because I already knew how this family worked. Yet when my sister uploaded a photo of her brand new apartment keys and wrote that caption about having the best parents ever, I felt that quiet click inside my chest where disappointment turns into decision, so I blocked them all. Without a speech, without a warning, and 2 days later my mom was on my porch, sobbing. I wish I could say I was shocked, but the truth is that you do not get blindsided by a pattern that has been teaching the same lesson since childhood. And while I sat there looking at that photo with the little hand hearts in the comments, and the cousin saying how beautiful the kitchen must be, and the aunt asking when the housewarming party is, I was running through the greatest hits of our family logic where my sister's needs were emergencies, and my needs were character building, where my birthday was a scheduling conflict yet her half-promotion at a part-time job warranted a dinner we could not afford, and where my parents would tell anyone who listened that they raised independent daughters while also treating one of us like a permanent fundraiser. I had told myself for years that I was fine with the difference because independence has a way of becoming your favorite story about yourself, and I wore it like a badge through every loan form and every late night and every side gig. But birthdays have this strange way of cutting through your grown-up armor, because you remember being a kid waiting by the phone, you remember the cheap cake that somehow still meant you were seen, and you cling to the idea that the day your mother brought you into the world might still be a line she is unwilling to cross. So when the day ended in silence and the next thing I saw was my sister's keys with that shiny caption, it felt like someone finally said the quiet part out loud. I stared at the screen and thought about the tiny explanations I used to give for them, the ones that made other people nod and say families are complicated, because it was always timing or stress or money. Yet, somehow timing and stress and money never stopped the gifts flowing one way and the advice flowing the other, and seeing that caption made me realize I was done doing public relations for people who would not spend 1 minute doing basic decency for me. So I opened my settings and I did the small cruel thing that feels like standing up straight for the first time. I removed the entire family from the part of my life where I let them watch me. Blocking them was not dramatic. It was quiet and practical and almost boring, because the outrage had burned off during years of rationalizing, and what remained was clarity, a clean boundary with the volume turned down. And as soon as I did it, the room got lighter, like I could finally hear myself think without their running commentary about how I should be grateful for being so strong. And because I know my mother, I knew she would not notice the block itself for a while, but she would notice the missing access when she tried to test the temperature of my life the way she always does. Friends tell me I should have said something first, a speech or a letter, or at least a message saying that the birthday silence was the last straw, and maybe they are right in a universe where words mean the same thing to everyone. Yet in my family, words are just a way to reset the scoreboard until the next round, so I decided to skip the theater and go straight to action. And my action was to give them what they had been practicing on me for years, which was distance dressed up as virtue. I went to bed that night not triumphant but steady, answering no calls, scrolling past no memories, breathing in the kind of quiet that does not ask you to make excuses. And by the next morning the family group chat was pinging in that way it pings when someone wants control dressed as concern, except now I could not see it, and they could not see me, which turned out to be the first real gift I had given myself in a long time. And I kept my phone face down because I knew how this always plays out. First the confused questions, then the jokes, then the guilt, then the warnings about how you will regret this someday when it is too late. By the evening my cousin sent a screenshot to a friend who sent it to me because that is how family works when you cut the cord, all sideways traffic and backdoor updates. And the screenshot was my sister basking in 100 congratulations, and the caption screaming that our parents were the standard, and I laughed one of those bitter little laughs that are not pretty but are honest. Because the standard had always been crystal clear, and I had finally decided I did not need to keep pretending. It was complicated, so I made dinner, answered emails, folded laundry, and waited for the inevitable escalation that comes when you stop playing along. It did not take long, because 2 days later there was a knock that did not feel like a knock, more like a demand that wanted to be a prayer, and when I opened the door there was my mom with her makeup running and her voice breaking and her hands reaching. Already mid-sentence about how I was tearing the family apart, and that is where I stood, half inside and half out, watching the person who taught me to swallow hurt try to swallow the fact that I had finally refused, and as she begged me to listen, I realized she had no idea that the conversation she came for had ended before it began. I did not invite my mother in right away, because before I let her flood my hallway with apologies that would come stapled to conditions, I needed to remind myself that the tears on my porch were not the beginning of the story, but only the latest installment in a long routine where my needs were framed as lessons while my sister's wants were framed as emergencies. So I stood in the doorway long enough to feel the old ache rise and then level out, and as she choked out my name I let my mind walk back through the quiet inventory I have been keeping since I was young enough to understand that in our family attention traveled on a one-way street that did not include me unless someone needed help moving, help paying, or help explaining why they could not show up. Back then it was simple things that stacked into something heavy, like the birthday I spent working a double shift while my sister got a surprise dinner because she had finally shown up to a class she had skipped for weeks. Or the way my college bill was a motivational speech while her summer program was an investment in her future, and when anyone asked where the line was I got told not to be jealous, which was funny in that not funny way, because jealousy implies you want what someone else has, rather than just wanting not to be erased, and I learned to swallow it and make it look like pride in my independence, because if you pretend you like carrying everything, fewer people try to hand you their stuff. By the time I was paying my own rent and buying discount cake on my birthdays, I had mastered the art of the rationalization press release, which meant I could explain away almost anything with a breezy line about how some families just show love differently. Yet somewhere along the way I started saving proof in a folder I never named out loud, and that folder became its own spine, a collection of undelivered texts, unanswered voicemails, canceled plans, and awkward money transfers that showed up only when my sister needed to land on her feet after jumping without looking, and I am not ashamed to say that the folder made me feel sane, because it kept me from rewriting history to make other people more comfortable. When my sister posted those keys in that caption, I opened the folder like you open a medicine cabinet you keep for emergencies, and I added one more item, and then, because I have learned that facts speak louder than crying, I went looking for what anyone can find if they stop pretending not to see it, which in this case was the public record that confirmed exactly who co-signed her lease and exactly who wired the first month's and the deposit. And I sat with that confirmation not because I needed the number or the figure, but because I needed the clarity that this was not a misunderstanding or a busy week or a slip of memory. It was a choice, and I had the receipts for it like I had the receipts for everything else. I typed a message that I did not send to my parents because I knew how that movie ends. Instead, I wrote something to the people who believe my mother's version of me. The neighbors and cousins and church friends who love a tidy story about the strong older daughter and the baby sister who just needs a little help to get started. And I kept it calm and almost boring on purpose. A straight row of facts with dates and examples, and the kind of small details no one remembers unless they were there living it, and I attached screenshots that were scrubbed clean of anything petty or private, and I linked to the same records anyone could check if they cared to spend 5 minutes doing it. Then I read it aloud to myself to make sure it sounded like a person telling the truth rather than a person begging for sympathy, and when I was satisfied that it did the first and not the second, I set it to go live at a time when the most eyes would be on their phones, which is a trick I learned from watching my sister chase attention like it was oxygen. I do not owe anyone a thesis on why I did not simply walk away, because walking away is what I have been doing for years, smiling and making it easy for everyone else to keep loving the myth of us. Whereas this was me turning on the light and letting the mess be visible without raising my voice, and if that sounds cold then maybe it is, but cold is what happens when you have been told your whole life that warmth is for the child who needs it more. And I am done apologizing for refusing to keep a secret that only injures me. So I let my mother stand there on the porch with her palms out and her voice tight with urgency, and I listened until she reached the part where she always reaches, The part about how family should keep things in house, and how I am making them look bad, and how I am going to regret this when we are older, and I felt that small steady flame that has nothing to do with hate and everything to do with self-respect. And I told her that I was finished protecting their reputation at the expense of my sanity, which she waved off as drama the way she always does, and while she launched into the version of the script where I am the cold one, I glanced at the clock, counted down silently from a very small number that I said in my head as words, and felt my phone buzz as the post published itself exactly when I wanted it to, dressed in facts and timestamps and the kind of polite tone that makes denial look ridiculous, and as my mother kept pleading, I watched the light from her screen begin to strobe with new messages that she could not quite hide, and I did not smile. I just opened the door a little wider and said she could come in if she wanted water, because the thing she was trying to stop had already started, and the room would be different now whether she stepped inside or not. The hours that followed my mother's visit weren't loud or cathartic or full of shaking fists and slammed doors like in the kind of movies that try to wrap up decades of resentment in one well-lit monologue. They were quieter than I expected, almost disappointingly quiet, and maybe that was the strangest part of it all. Not the fallout, not the family text chains unraveling, not even the cousins who suddenly remembered how off things had seemed all along, but the overwhelming stillness that followed once I had finally said the one thing I had never dared say out loud, that I didn't want back in, that I wasn't looking for closure, that I wasn't hoping for a transformation or a tearful confession or some last-minute rewrite of a history they had authored without my input for years. I just wanted out, and I meant it. I think people expect dramatic revenge to feel like a firework, a big bang that lights up the sky and makes everyone gasp and cheer, but in reality, it felt more like finally getting out of a crowded room you didn't realize had been suffocating you until you took your first real breath outside, and the air tasted like honesty, bitter but clean. And I sat there in my apartment that now felt a little larger than it had before, letting the weight slide off my shoulders one layer at a time without asking myself whether I was being too harsh, because I had carried this entire dynamic for so long it had started to reshape my spine, and the idea that I was now allowed to stand up straight again felt like the real beginning of adulthood. They called, of course, first my father, whose voice I hadn't heard in months unless it was echoing in the background while my mom tried to convince me to just come for dinner, we miss you, and his voicemail was a strange cocktail of disappointment and fatigue. As if I had somehow exhausted him by no longer being easy to ignore, and he didn't say much beyond that I was better than this, which, if we're being honest, was a sentence he only ever used when I stopped letting people walk over me. And then came my sister, who didn't leave a voicemail at all but sent a text, short and sharp and saturated with the kind of arrogance only someone completely convinced of her own innocence could muster, telling me that I had always been jealous, always been dramatic, and always needed attention, which was, if nothing else, a breathtakingly ironic thing to say considering she had posted a full carousel of her apartment tour less than 48 hours earlier with her face in every frame and a caption that could have been a Hallmark card crossed with a real estate ad. I didn't respond, not because I had nothing to say, believe me, there were entire speeches I could have delivered with the kind of specificity that only comes from having rehearsed them through years of quiet betrayal, but because I had finally realized that there is a kind of silence that isn't passive or weak or scared, a kind of silence that feels like drawing a clean border around your life and saying, what's inside here is mine, and you don't get to cross it anymore unless you ask, and I say yes, and that was the silence I was committed to now, not out of spite but out of sheer, exhausted self-preservation. In the days that followed, the ripple effects began to show themselves. A family friend who had always nodded sympathetically whenever I mentioned feeling left out suddenly liked my post and sent a message saying, I always wondered why you weren't at more family events, which made me laugh harder than I'd laughed in weeks, because it had never been a mystery, just an open secret no one wanted to name, and an old neighbor who used to bake my sister cookies every time she passed an exam. Never mind that those exams were often retakes for classes she'd nearly flunked, messaged to say how sorry she was and how strong I was being, which felt nice, sure, but also underscored just how much of my pain had been politely ignored for years by people who didn't want to get involved unless the story had already been edited into something digestible. Even my aunt, my mother's older sister, the one who had always seemed to sit just far enough outside the chaos to pretend she didn't see it, called me late one night, her voice low and careful, asking if I was okay and whether I had really meant what I posted. And when I said yes, she paused for a long moment and then admitted that she had seen it too over the years, but didn't know how to step in without making things worse, and I didn't thank her for that honesty, because it wasn't really for me, but I appreciated it anyway because it confirmed something I'd always suspected, that the truth wasn't hidden, just inconvenient. I stayed quiet online after that, not because I regretted speaking, but because I didn't need to keep performing the pain, and when my mother called again, twice in the same afternoon, her voicemails bouncing between anger and heartbreak like a ping-pong ball, I still didn't pick up, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I wasn't interested in explaining the difference between being hurt and being disloyal to someone who had mistaken my silence for consent for most of my adult life. And when the final message came, a long paragraph from my mother that began with, "We never meant to hurt you," and ended with, "We're your family no matter what," I stared at the words for a long time before deleting them without reading the middle. Because intention is a currency that only spends well when it's backed by action, and for the first time in years, I wasn't broke anymore. It wasn't until the third day after my post went live that my mother finally stopped trying to reach me through calls and voicemails and started showing up in person again, not with the same desperate tears as before, but this time with a kind of quiet urgency that looked less like concern for me and more like damage control. The way someone hurries to tape up a sinking boat not because they're afraid of drowning, but because they don't want anyone else to notice it's leaking. She didn't bring groceries or flowers or one of those guilt-laced casseroles she used to use as apology currency when she forgot a birthday or skipped a recital. She just showed up with a printed copy of my post and a trembling hand that looked like it hadn't held anything heavier than entitlement in years, and she asked me, very calmly, if we could talk like adults, which was rich coming from the same woman who had dismissed my feelings for decades with phrases like, "You're just sensitive," and "You always take things the wrong way." I let her in, not because I wanted reconciliation or healing or any of the tidy words people throw around when they want to skip over real accountability, but because I wanted to see if she could sit in the mess without reaching for a broom. If she could finally look at me not as the difficult daughter or the reliable backup plan, but as a full human being who had quietly borne the weight of being overlooked for far too long. And as we sat down in the kitchen, I watched her eyes move around the room like she was trying to take inventory of my life, as if the things I had built without her help would somehow give her clues to a version of me she had never bothered to know. She started with the same line she always does when she's cornered, "We never meant to hurt you," and I didn't interrupt, even though that line has always sounded to me like a magician's flourish. The kind of misdirection that tries to pull focus away from what actually happened and center the illusion that intention is more important than impact. And she kept talking, layering on words like family, mistakes, misunderstandings, each one carefully chosen to avoid anything too sharp or specific, until finally I asked her if she could name the last thing she did for me that wasn't transactional. That wasn't followed by a favor for my sister or a reminder about how hard things are financially or a suggestion that I should be more forgiving because life's too short. She froze at that, and I saw it, the moment she realized I wasn't looking for an apology, but for acknowledgement. The kind that doesn't come with excuses or a shifting of blame or a rundown of how hard she had it raising two girls on a teacher's salary while Dad picked up extra shifts at the shop, because I've heard that song before, and I know every beat of it by heart. And while I have never doubted that raising kids is hard, I also know that the difference between fairness and favoritism isn't always written in bank statements. Sometimes it's in the extra 5 minutes you spend listening to one child's story and not the other. The way you light up at one person's news while offering lukewarm nods to the other's victories. She tried to pivot, of course, asking me why I would air dirty laundry in front of extended family and old friends and total strangers online, and I told her the truth, plain and without heat. That for years I kept everything inside to protect the image of a family that only existed when it was convenient for them, and that silence was the cost of admission to that illusion, and I was no longer willing to pay it. She said my sister was devastated, that people were calling her ungrateful and spoiled, that her new landlord had seen the post and started asking questions about the lease, and I said I was sorry, not for telling the truth, but for the fact that the truth had been so thoroughly ignored for so long that its first appearance in daylight felt like a scandal. She asked what it would take for me to delete the post, to issue a clarification or at least a softer follow-up, and I told her that if she wanted the world to see her in a better light, she should have behaved like someone worthy of that image before the cameras ever turned on, and her mouth tightened into that familiar shape it always takes when she's been told no by someone she believes should still be seeking her approval. And I realized in that moment that the tears from the porch had never been about me, not really. They had been about the erosion of control, about the loss of a version of the story that cast her as the devoted mother and me as the wayward daughter who just needed to come back to the fold. I reminded her of all the birthdays she skipped, the holidays I spent alone, the times I was told to understand, when money was too tight for my needs, but magically available when my sister wanted to study abroad or move into a new place. And I watched her face twitch with the effort of pretending those things hadn't happened exactly as I described them, and when she finally stood up and gathered her papers and her pride, she said she hoped I knew I was tearing the family apart, and I told her. She had done that all by herself. I had just stopped covering it up. As she walked out, slower than she'd arrived, I didn't follow, didn't call after her, didn't offer comfort or kindness or one last thread of hope that maybe, with time, things would return to the way they were, because the truth is, I never wanted them to return there, not anymore. Not after I had tasted what it felt like to live without constantly shrinking myself to make space for everyone else's comfort, and if that made me the villain in her version of events, I could live with that. Because for once, I wasn't playing a role written by someone else. In the weeks that followed what my mother would no doubt call the incident, the shape of my life didn't implode the way people always warn you it will when you cut off family, and instead, what actually happened was so much more disarming because nothing collapsed. Things simply stabilized, settled, grew quieter in a way that made me realize how much noise I had learned to live with, the kind that hums beneath everything, the constant guilt-picking, the passive-aggressive check-ins. Disguised as concern, the invitations with asterisks that let you know your presence is optional, your absence expected, and your worth conditional, and once that noise stopped, once the phone stopped buzzing with carefully timed updates about how well my sister was doing or how concerned someone was about my recent behavior, I found that I could finally hear my own thoughts without having to translate them into something more palatable for other people's comfort. I didn't expect the fallout to reach as far as it did, and I certainly didn't expect the post to keep spreading long after the initial flash had faded, but it turned out that the story struck a chord, not because I was special, but because I wasn't. Because apparently, there were thousands of people just like me, people who had spent years being the emotional scaffolding for families that leaned on them, but never credited them, people who knew what it felt like to sit in the second row of their own lives while someone else was constantly handed the spotlight, and my inbox filled with strangers who said things like, "I thought I was crazy until I read this," and "I haven't spoken to my mom in 5 years, and this just gave me peace." And while none of those messages healed anything directly, they reminded me that this kind of pain was not unique to me, that the loneliness I'd carried for so long was part of a bigger silence, one that so many of us had been told to keep out of respect. My sister finally reached out again, not with apologies or insight, but with a half-hearted threat, a text saying that if I didn't take it all down, she'd have no choice but to explain her side. As if there were some version of this reality where screenshots could be undone and bank records could be reinterpreted and childhood memories could be redacted by sheer force of will. And I didn't respond because I had already spent enough of my life giving her the benefit of the doubt, enough years assuming that if I was just a little more understanding, a little more forgiving, then maybe she'd meet me halfway. But I know now that you can't meet someone halfway if they've been standing on a platform you built, watching you struggle in the mud and calling it character development. Professionally, Something strange happened too. A recruiter reached out to me after seeing the post, someone I'd met briefly at a networking event years ago and had completely forgotten about, and they told me that the way I'd handled the situation, the calmness, the clarity, the refusal to play victim, was exactly the kind of mindset their company valued. And before I could fully process what was happening, I was sitting in a virtual interview, being asked questions not about family or feelings, but about leadership and resilience, and by the end of the call, I was offered a new role, a better salary, a clean slate, and in that moment, it became clear to me that telling the truth, even when it feels like it might cost you everything, can sometimes hand you back more than you ever expected to lose. When I accepted the offer, I didn't tell my family, because by then the idea of performing those life milestones for them, like sending out press releases for my own achievements in hopes that someone might clap, felt absurd. And when I packed up my apartment and moved into a new space, I didn't post any photos, didn't write any captions, didn't try to make anyone jealous or regretful or curious, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing their recognition. I was simply living my own narrative, without the background noise of needing to be seen, and that kind of freedom felt heavier and more solid than any applause I could have fished for online. I don't know what my parents are telling people now. Maybe they're painting me as ungrateful, difficult, or bitter, or maybe they've gone silent, pretending like none of it happened, hoping the story fades the way so many uncomfortable truths do when people stop repeating them. But either way, I'm not watching anymore, not waiting for them to change or explain or apologize, because I've stopped giving them the editing rights to my life. And while that may sound cold to someone who still believes in tidy endings, I've come to understand that some stories aren't meant to circle back to reconciliation. Some are meant to end when the lesson is learned and the pattern is broken and the audience finally understands why the protagonist had to walk away. So no, I didn't unblock them, and I don't plan to. I didn't reach out on Mother's Day or Christmas or anyone's birthday. I didn't cave when a cousin tried to play peacemaker by reminding me that they're getting older, as if aging absolves you of decades of emotional negligence. As if proximity to death is a reason to rush back into pain just to avoid looking like the bad guy at the funeral. And maybe that makes me cold, or distant, or petty. I'm sure they've all said worse behind closed doors, but I also know this. When I look in the mirror now, I see someone who finally stood up for herself, someone who stopped shrinking to make others feel taller, someone who gave up the exhausting pursuit of fairness in a family that only ever practiced favoritism with a straight face. And if I ever do hear from them again, if another letter shows up, or a voicemail lands in my inbox, or someone tries to talk to me at a wedding or a reunion, I won't yell, I won't fight, I won't cry. I'll just listen, nod, and walk away, because I've already had the final word, and it wasn't cruel or angry or dramatic, it was truthful. And sometimes the truth is the most powerful revenge there is.